The dog didn't growl when Nadia Voss walked through the gate. That was the first thing everyone got wrong. They expected teeth, they expected blood. What they got instead was 48 hours of absolute silence from a Belgian Malinois who hadn't eaten in 6 days, hadn't responded to a single command in 3 weeks, and had already sent 2 handlers to the infirmary, one with a fractured wrist, one with 14 stitches across his forearm. What they got was Ghost staring at Nadia Voss from across the training yard like he was reading something written on the back of her skull. Nobody in that yard knew what to make of it, including Nadia. The call had come on a Tuesday morning, which was already a bad sign. Good assignments never came on Tuesdays. Nadia had been halfway through her second cup of coffee at her kitchen table in Raleigh, reviewing behavioral assessment notes for a civilian search and rescue dog out of Charlotte, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. She'd spent the last 4 years carefully curating a life that didn't include 6 a.m. phone calls from unknown numbers, and she wasn't in a hurry to change that. She picked it up anyway. The voice on the other end identified itself as Commander Dale Ashworth, Naval Special Warfare Command, Virginia Beach. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told her they had a tactical K9 asset with a clean operational record going back 5 years. He told her the dog's handler had been killed in action 8 weeks ago. He told her the dog had since become what he called non-functional, and that 2 of his best trainers had been unable to re-establish any working relationship with the animal. Then he told her they were 48 hours from a euthanasia order. Nadia set down her coffee. "What's the dog's breed?" she asked. "Belgian Malinois, call sign Ghost, 4 years old. Who trained him originally?" There was a pause. "Not a long one, but long enough. That's part of why we're calling you." She drove up the next morning, 4 hours north on I-95, through the flat pine corridor of the Carolina coast, with the windows down and her notes spread across the passenger seat. Commander Ashworth had emailed her a basic file, Ghost's operational record, his veterinary history, his last 3 performance evaluations. All excellent, all the way up until the week after Master Chief Petty Officer Ryan Kelso was killed in a training accident off the coast of Bahrain. After that, the file went quiet. 3 weeks of incident reports. Refusal to eat. Refusal to comply. 2 handler injuries documented in clipped, careful language that didn't quite hide the fact that those men had been genuinely scared. Then a recommendation for permanent removal from active duty, signed by someone whose title was longer than his name. Then a second signature, recommending euthanasia. Nadia read the second signature 3 times. Then she folded the papers and put them on the back seat where she couldn't see them anymore. She'd been brought in as a behavioral consultant. That was the official title. She ran a small practice out of Raleigh that specialized in working dogs, law enforcement K9s, search and rescue animals, occasionally military contracts when the work was civilian adjacent enough not to require a security clearance she didn't have. She was 29 years old. She drove a truck with a cracked dashboard and 140,000 miles on it, and she had never once in her professional life worn anything with a military insignia on it. None of that was going to make this easy. The base at Virginia Beach looked exactly like she expected. Wide, flat, intensely organized. Every building exactly where you'd expect it to be. Every person moving with the specific kind of purpose that came from years of being told that hesitation was a character flaw. A young petty officer met her at the gate and drove her to the K9 training facility in a vehicle that smelled like gun oil and fast food. Commander Ashworth was waiting for her outside the main building. He was a big man, somewhere in his late 40s, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades carrying weight he wasn't allowed to put down. He shook her hand once, firm and brief, and looked her over in a way that wasn't quite rude but wasn't quite polite either. "Dr. Voss," he said. The title came out slightly sideways, like he wasn't sure it applied. "Just Nadia is fine. We appreciate you making the drive." Tell me about the handler, she said. Ryan Kelso. Ashworth glanced at the petty officer who found somewhere else to be. What about him? How long had he been working with Ghost? Since the dog completed initial training. 3 years, so Ghost was his first and only handler. Yes, and Kelso was killed 8 weeks ago. Correct, and the first handler injury happened when? Week 3. Nadia nodded slowly. Okay. Ashworth tilted his head. Okay, what? Okay, I understand the situation. She looked past him toward the training yard, where a chain-link enclosure sat in the hard morning sun. She could see the dog from where she was standing. He was lying against the far fence, completely still, his dark muzzle resting on his forepaws. Watching. Can I see his kennel space first, before I see him in the yard? What she got instead was a tour of the facility led by a man named Chief Petty Officer Brett Vance, who was approximately 6'3", had forearms like dock rope, and clearly believed that Nadia Voss was going to be a problem. He didn't say this, he was too professional to say it, but he walked 2 steps ahead of her down every corridor, answered her questions with the precise minimum number of words, and twice referred to her as the consultant, while talking to other people in her presence. The kennel was at the back of the building, clean, climate-controlled, the kind of careful maintenance that told you the people here took their animals seriously even when they'd given up on them. Ghost's space was the last one on the left. There was a water bowl, full and fresh. There was a food bowl with kibble in it that hadn't been touched, and there was, lying in the corner of the kennel, a well-worn nylon tug toy, faded green, fraying at both ends, that nobody had thought to remove. Nadia crouched down in front of the kennel door and looked at the tug toy for a long time. That was Kelso's, she asked. Vance crossed his arms. Been in there since the dog came back stateside. Has anyone removed it? Tried. First week. Dog went. He stopped. It was better to leave it. Nadia stood up. I'd like to go into the yard now. The silence that followed lasted about 3 full seconds, which in a military training facility is a surprisingly long time. Into the yard, Vance repeated. Yes, with Ghost, that's correct. He looked at her the way people look at someone who has just said something so unreasonable that they're not sure it was meant seriously. Then he looked at Commander Ashworth, who was standing in the kennel doorway with his arms at his sides and an expression of careful neutrality on his face. Commander, Vance said, not a question exactly. More of an opportunity. Ashworth said nothing. Vance looked back at Nadia. You've reviewed the incident reports. I have. Then you know what that dog did to Henderson. And to Martinez, I know what the reports say. I was there for Henderson, Vance said. His voice was flat, but something moved behind it. That dog didn't warn, didn't growl, didn't posture, just went. 14 stitches. I understand, do you? It wasn't a question. Nadia held his gaze. She'd been in rooms like this before, rooms full of people who had decided, before she opened her mouth, that she wasn't the right person for the job. She'd learned a long time ago that arguing in those rooms was pointless. You didn't change minds with words, you changed them with outcomes. I'd like to go into the yard, she said again. Alone, no other personnel inside the fence line. Vance exhaled through his nose. That's not a controlled environment. No, it's not. If something happens, then something happens. She looked at him evenly. That's my call to make. Not yours. Another silence. Longer this time. It was Commander Ashworth who finally spoke. Open the gate, Chief. What nobody in that yard understood, what nobody had thought to ask about, because nobody had thought to ask her any questions that weren't about the incident reports or the liability paperwork, was that Nadia Voss had met Ghost before. Not recently, not under these circumstances, but 4 years ago, when she was 25 and still doing her postgraduate fieldwork in working animal behavior at a Department of Defense research facility outside of Jacksonville. She had spent 3 weeks observing the early training cohort that included a young Belgian Malinois, barely 18 months old, who had been flagged for exceptional drive and responsiveness. She had spent approximately 6 hours total in that training yard. She had run the dog through a series of behavioral exercises. She had written 14 pages of field notes. She had also, on her last day at the facility, sat on the floor of that kennel for 40 minutes, while a young Malinois with enormous amber eyes put his head in her lap and fell asleep. She had not included that detail in the field notes. It wasn't relevant to the research. She thought about it now as she walked through the gate and heard the latch close behind her, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The yard was about 60 feet across. Packed dirt, a few training obstacles pushed to the edges, a tarp strung up for shade on the far side. Ghost was at the far end, on his feet now, watching her. He was magnificent even like this, even thin, even hollowed out with whatever was moving through him, all dark fur and coiled attention and the specific unsettling intelligence of a dog who had been trained to read humans the way humans read books. Nadia stopped walking about 20 feet from him. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't reach out her hand. She didn't speak. She just stopped, shifted her weight to her heels, and let her arms hang loose at her sides. Outside the fence, she could hear someone say something low and sharp. She didn't catch the words. Ghost didn't move. Nadia let 30 seconds pass. Then she sat down in the dirt, not crouched, not kneeling. Sat down cross-legged in the middle of the training yard, like she had nowhere else to be, like the sun wasn't baking the back of her neck, like there wasn't a 48-hour euthanasia order hanging over this dog like a storm front. She heard someone at the fence say, "What is she?" and then someone else say, "Quiet." Ghost watched her. She waited. At the 2-minute mark, his ears shifted. Not forward sideways the way a dog's ears go when something unexpected is happening, and they're trying to decide if it's a threat or not. At the 4-minute mark, he took a single step toward her, then stopped. At the 6-minute mark, he took 3 more steps, then stopped again, close enough now that she could hear him breathing. She still didn't look at him directly. At the 8-minute mark, he put his nose 6 inches from her left hand and inhaled. And at the 8-minute and 20-second mark, Ghost sat down next to Nadia Voss in the dirt. Not in front of her, not facing her, beside her, facing the same direction she was facing, like they were both looking at the same distant thing. The silence at the fence was so complete that Nadia could hear the flag line tapping against its pole 50 yards away. After another minute without looking at him, she said quietly, "Hey, buddy." Ghost's tail moved once. A single, slow sweep through the dirt. That was the moment. That was the one that she'd think about for years afterward. Not the dramatic entrance, not the gate closing behind her, but that one quiet tail, sweep in the dirt, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been left unfinished for 8 weeks. She didn't know it yet, but 3 of the men watching from outside the fence had gone completely still. Vance, who had spent 20 years working military K9s, had not moved in 60 seconds. Commander Ashworth had taken off his cover and was holding it at his side. A young specialist whose name she'd never get, standing off to the left, had stopped chewing his gum. Ghost leaned against her shoulder. She let him. The debrief happened in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and whiteboard markers. Nadia sat at one end of the table with a bottle of water she hadn't opened. Ashworth sat at the other end. Vance stood near the window, which meant he didn't trust himself to be neutral if he sat down. 4 other men were in the room. Handlers, trainers, men with ranks she didn't bother to track because they weren't relevant to the conversation she needed to have. "What you did out there," Ashworth started, "was behavioral positioning," she said. Non-threatening posture, reduced eye contact, allowed him to initiate all contact. It's textbook working animal psychology. 2 of my best trainers couldn't get within 10 feet of him. 2 of your best trainers went in standing at full height with direct eye contact and an expectation of compliance. She didn't say it unkindly. Ghost isn't aggressive. He's grieving. Those are not the same thing, and they require completely different responses. Something shifted in the room. She felt it more than saw it. He injured 2 people, someone down the table said. She thought his name was Decker, or something similar. Didn't matter. He was approached as a liability and responded accordingly. She looked at Ashworth. You know what he is. You don't need me to tell you. 4 years of operational work, 0 incidents, commendations in his record that most human operators don't get. That dog didn't break. He shut down. There's a difference. Vance spoke without turning from the window. His handler is dead. Yes, he's not getting that back. No, she agreed. He's not. She paused. But grief doesn't make a working dog non-functional. Unacknowledged grief does. Someone should have brought in a behavioral assessment week 1, not week 8. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. Ashworth looked at the table for a moment. He responded to you. He responded to someone who sat down in the dirt and waited for him. That's not a special skill. That's patience. He didn't respond to patience from my people, because your people were performing patience. They were waiting for him to come around, so they could go back to getting compliance. Ghost knows the difference. She picked up her water bottle finally, turned it in her hands. Ryan Kelso didn't treat him like a weapon. I'd guess he talked to him like a partner. Am I right? The men in the room looked at each other. Vance turned around from the window. Yeah, Ashworth said quietly. Then that's what Ghost is waiting for. Not a new handler, not a training protocol. He's waiting for someone to see him the same way Kelso saw him. She set the water bottle down. That might take time. It might take months. But he's not broken, Commander. He's just waiting. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. The euthanasia order is premature. Her voice was calm and clear. And I'd like to recommend against it in writing if you'll give me the paperwork. More silence. Then Vance, still standing by the window, said something she didn't expect. Kelso talked about you. She looked up. He mentioned a researcher from his early training days. Said she was the one who figured out Ghost had off-the-charts scent discrimination before the program even got to that phase. Said she just knew. He paused. He said Ghost remembered her. Nadia looked at Vance for a moment. Dogs have longer social memories than most people give them credit for. He called you the dog whisperer lady. A pause. Not in a bad way. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile. Ryan was a good handler. Best I ever saw, Vance said. Simply, like a fact. The room went quiet again, but differently. Not the careful, guarded silence of before, something more like respect acknowledging itself. What happens now? Ashworth asked. I need 3 weeks. Supervised reintegration, behavioral monitoring, gradual reintroduction to command vocabulary. If Ghost responds the way I think he will, you'll have your asset back. She looked at him steadily. If he doesn't, you can revisit the order. But you give him 3 weeks before you make a permanent decision about an animal who served this unit for 4 years. Ashworth looked at the table, looked at Vance, looked back at Nadia. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. She drove back to the kennel alone after the debrief. It was late afternoon, the heat settling into the base like something physical, the light going golden and flat across the concrete. She found Ghost at the back of his kennel, lying on his side with his face toward the door, the faded green tug toy between his paws. She sat down on the floor outside the kennel door. He watched her. Hey, buddy, she said. Same words as before, same quiet. His tail moved twice this time, a little more certain. She stayed there until the evening shift change. Nobody asked her to leave. Vance walked past at some point and saw her sitting there with her back against the wall, and her notes in her lap and Ghost 3 feet away through the chain link, watching her with those enormous amber eyes. He didn't say anything. He just kept walking. But she noticed, when she came back the next morning, that someone had brought a folding chair and left it outside Ghost's kennel door. A decent one, padded, not a field chair. The kind someone brought in from an office. She used it every day for the next 3 weeks. The work was not dramatic. That was the part nobody saw, the part that didn't fit into the version of the story that Vance would end up telling people for years. The work was sitting, waiting, reading Ghost's body language the way you read a conversation, the set of his ears, the angle of his shoulders, the moment when his eyes went soft instead of hard. It was reintroducing command vocabulary one word at a time, never with correction, always with acknowledgement. It was letting him dictate the pace of every single interaction until the pace became his own, and then slowly something shared. On day 4, he ate in front of her. Not a lot, but something. On day 9, he brought her the tug toy. She didn't take it, not yet. She just let him hold it and sit next to her and breathe. On day 14, she put the toy in her pocket and he didn't protest, just watched it go like he understood. On day 18, she ran him through a basic command sequence. Sit, down, stay, recall, and he ran it like he was reading her mind. Fluid, immediate, precise. The muscle memory intact, the trust rebuilt enough to let him access it. Vance was watching from the observation platform. When Ghost hit the recall and came in tight to Nadia's left leg, and looked up at her with an expression that could only be described as ready, Vance took off his cover and turned around and looked at the wall for a few seconds, like there was something on it. There wasn't anything on it. On day 21, Commander Ashworth came down to the training yard himself. He stood at the fence and watched Nadia run Ghost through a full operational sequence, a compressed version of the kind of scenario Ghost would have run in the field. The dog was extraordinary, that was the only word for it. Fluid and ferocious and absolutely precise, responding to Nadia's signals the way water responds to gravity. Like there was no distinction between the instruction and the execution. Ashworth watched for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Dr. Voss." She brought Ghost into heel and looked at the commander. "What's your availability for the next 6 months?" Ghost looked up at her. She looked down at him. His eyes were clear, that specific, alert, amber clarity of a dog who was no longer waiting for something that wasn't coming, but who had found, in its place, something else to be present for. "I'm available," she said. She signed the contract in the same conference room 3 days later. Vance slid the folder across the table to her and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, what you did, it was something else. I sat in the dirt for 8 minutes. You sat in the dirt for 3 weeks." He paused. "And you knew, didn't you, that he'd remember you?" Nadia thought about a cold January morning 4 years ago. A young dog with oversized ears and too much energy, and a nose that could categorize sense the way a librarian categorizes books. A fieldwork log with 14 pages of behavioral notes, a detail she'd left out because it wasn't relevant to the research. "I hoped he might," she said. Vance nodded once, picked up his cover. "Welcome to the unit, Dr. Voss." She shook his hand. Ghost was lying under the table at her feet. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He was already exactly where he was supposed to be.